What's going on? My name's Jay, and today I've got 10 audio editing tips that are going to help you speed up your workflow and make your videos sound better. Let's take a look. All right, most of you guys know me by now, but if you don't, hi, my name's Jay. I'm an audio guy. I've been an audio guy for like over 20 years, and I've picked up a lot of tips along the way, and it was mostly in music, but it wasn't too far of a stretch when I had to bring those skills over to the video creation world when I first picked up a camera. And I get a lot of questions about audio. I get questions about my workflow and what mics I use, and how do I make my dialogue sound better, and what level should my music be at? And so today I thought I'd sit here and have a nice little heart-to-heart with you and give you my top 10 audio editing techniques that help me improve my workflow and make my videos sound better. And speaking of workflow, the first tip that I have is to actually create a workflow. It sounds stupid, but you have no idea how many times I've helped somebody edit and I've asked them, what's your workflow? And they're like,
I don't know, I just kind of dive in and do whatever.
Which I get is kind of commonplace when you're first starting out, but really setting a workflow, figuring out what you do to make your videos sound good, and doing that over and over and over again on every single video is going to accomplish two things, basically. One, you're going to have a much faster workflow, which means that audio editing process is just going to get faster and faster and faster. Two, if you do something like run a YouTube channel, then all of your videos are going to have fairly consistent audio quality throughout your whole channel. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you what your workflow should be, and this is kind of where some people are going to hate on me, because as far as I'm concerned, your workflow is a personal thing. It's like editing a video or editing anything else. It's your style. It's how your brain works. So figure out the workflow that works for you. You can borrow other people's until you figure out what actually works for you. For instance, I am coming out with a brand new audio editing workflow tutorial thing fairly soon, so make sure you're subscribed if you want to check that out. But the point is to practice different things, figure out what works, what doesn't, create your workflow, and just start repeating that process on every video that you make. Now, a huge part of my workflow and my second tip is to organize your audio tracks. And what I mean by organizing your audio tracks is having dedicated audio tracks for different types of sound. So I usually have 2 to 3 tracks per source. So let's say I'm doing a tutorial, right? I got 2 audio sources mainly. I have my camera and I have my computer. So I have 2 audio tracks for my camera audio, and I've got 2 audio tracks for my computer audio, and then I've got 2 for sound effects and 2 for ambient noise and 2 for music. Now this accomplishes 2 things. One, when I dive into an edit, I know exactly where everything's gonna go, and I know exactly where everything is, and it's gonna help editing a lot, because if you have an audio editor that allows you to edit an entire track at once, you've got all of your dialogue in a couple of tracks, and you can just edit them all at once, and it's super easy, and you don't have to go clip by clip necessarily. You can just edit the whole track and be done with it. And I've been talking a lot about dialogue and dialogue tracks, and that's for a reason, because tip number 3, dialogue comes first. Unless you have a video that doesn't have any dialogue in it whatsoever, everything revolves around the dialogue. It's the most important part of your sound design. I mean, think about it. If you can't hear what people are saying, how are they going to know the story? Yes, we can get into visual storytelling. It's a totally different talk, but for the purposes of this video, dialogue comes first. So instead of sitting there and thinking about whether or not the music is loud enough, make sure that it is loud enough in relationship to the dialogue. Is it overpowering? Is it maybe too low and now your voice kind of sounds empty because you need a little bit of a music bed to make your video sound fuller? Like, how does everything sound in relation to the dialogue? And speaking of dialogue, my 4th tip is to make sure that you actually edit your dialogue. Don't just slap it into a timeline and be done with it. Make sure you use EQ, compression, normalization, all those things. And that's like a whole video in and of itself, this whole dialogue editing thing, but make sure you're doing that stuff in order to get your voice sounding the way that you want it to sound. Now, yes, with a good mic, your dialogue will sound good right off the bat, but you can always make it sound better. You can always get rid of some of the background noise or get rid of some of the unwanted frequencies by using EQ. You can compress it a little bit so everything is, basically the same volume throughout the video. There's a ton of stuff that you can do. Make sure that you're doing it so you have the best sounding dialogue possible. My next tip is kind of a sound design tip, and that's to use room tone. Room tone it's a customary thing. It's best practice when you're making a video, whether it's a sit down talking head thing or an interview between two people or a movie or anything. It's just best practice to record 30 seconds to a minute of silence before you actually start talking, because then you can take that clip and you can use it throughout your video in order to even out the sound. And you don't just have to do that with room tone. You should do that if you're maybe filming outside and all that stuff. You should get some, ambient noise from your surroundings so you can use it in order to smooth out the cuts between footage. Cody Warner actually did an amazing tutorial on that. I will link it down below. All right, moving on. My next tip is to actually get a good mix for your sound. And that sounds stupid and obvious, but just bear with me because I actually do mean something when I say that. You don't just want to go until it sounds good because, your headphones might be screwed up, your ears might be screwed up, but there are actually standard volume levels that everything should be at. And if you stay within those ranges, 9 times out of 10, you're going to get a good mix and you don't have to worry about it. And if you're wondering what those levels are, your dialogue should be at -18 to -9 dB. Your music should be -22 to -18 dB, and your sound effects and your ambience should be -20 to -10 dB. dB stands for decibels, by the way, just in case you didn't know. Now you know. Now, one caveat to this, and one thing that I want to kind of warn you against, is that on YouTube there seems to be this race to the top where everybody's trying to be louder than everybody else, and I would caution against that, because the thing is, if you crank up your volume too much, one, you're going to make your audience's ears bleed and nobody wants to see that. And two, it makes your video sound worse when you go too loud. That's just how it is. If you go way too loud, then it's gonna sound bad. So just stick within those levels and everything's gonna sound good. Having good quality audio is a lot more important than having a higher volume. And speaking of volume, my next tip is to use keyframes for your music volume. So you know how in movies and TV shows and even in vlogs, you'll have the talking bits and you'll have some quiet music underneath the talking bits, and then it'll go into some kind of cut scene or a B-roll sequence or something, and that music will get louder and then it'll go away. That's just very common practice across the board. A lot of people, when they first start making videos, myself included, what they do is they make cuts in the music track whenever there's supposed to be a volume change, and they just raise and lower those individual clips. And that is the exact wrong way to do this. What you should be doing is setting keyframes in your music track and then, raising and lowering the volumes based on those keyframes. And that way, instead of having hard cuts and making it all abrupt and really jarring, everything is kind of flowing and natural and normal, and it just sounds better. My next tip is to just simply normalize your master track. And this is a tiny little thing that takes 10 seconds to do that makes all of the difference. Now, by the time you actually get around to doing anything with the master track, all of your levels should be set for your dialogue and your music and your sound effects and all that stuff, and you should have a fairly good mix. But doing a little bit of normalization just to make sure that the whole video, the video as a whole is actually at the right level makes all the difference in the world. So just drop a little normalization on that master track, make sure it's set correctly, and you're good to go. And by the way, if you're thinking about it right now, stop. Compression on the master track is not the same as normalization. You want to normalize, you don't necessarily want to compress. I typically only compress the dialogue. I don't do it on the entire video. And speaking of compression, my next tip is to use everything in moderation. Look, I know when we start making videos and we start diving into audio editing, especially, we're looking around and we see all these cool effects and all these cool tools that we can use, and it's super exciting because now we got all this stuff and all these options that we can do with our audio. But just stop and step back. My chair is squeaking. Just stop, step back, breathe, just wait. because if you overuse that stuff, you're going to degrade the quality of your audio. It's not going to sound good. So the two biggest areas where I usually see a problem with this is in compression and in noise reduction. So like I said, I do use compression on my dialogue tracks, but it's very, very little. In fact, most of the work on my dialogue is done outside of the computer. It's done before I even start recording. I'm making sure that my mic placement is correct. I'm making sure that my recording levels are correct. And that way, my audio levels are pretty consistent across the board. So when I get into post, I just have to use a little bit of compression to get rid of some of those peaks, and then everything sounds good. What happens when you overcrank that compression is you start bringing up that low end, and now all of the low rumbles and stuff that your microphone picks up behind the scenes, they start to get really audible, and you start getting a lot of unwanted reverb in your voice, and it just sounds bad. So just, back off of the compression a little bit, just a teeny tiny bit. And when it comes to noise reduction, remember, it's noise reduction, not noise removal. So you don't need to be worried about removing all of the background noise, especially if it's like a busy scene where there's a lot of people around and there's traffic and there's wind and all this stuff. Like, you want to bring that down, but it doesn't need to be completely eliminated, because if you crank up that noise reduction tool too much, then your voice is going to start sounding weird. You're going to start sounding kind of like an alien. And I don't know about you, but I'm not into the whole, I mean aliens are cool and all, but like, I don't want to sound like one. So just crank up that tool enough so that your dialogue shines through, the noise is reduced. It's reduced enough for your dialogue to shine through. Once you get there, like right up until the point, just before you start sounding weird, is when you should stop. And fun fact, before we move on to the next tip, noise reduction is like my least favorite tool ever, because it's so difficult to find that sweet spot where like your voice is shining through, the background noise is reduced, you don't sound weird. Like, it's like this little sweet spot, and it's so hard to find sometimes. All right, my last tip is to actually spend time doing real sound design, like making your video sound like you're in the place that you're in. Now, I did a whole tutorial on that about my whole sound design, the mentality and workflow. And if you want to check that out, just watch this video right here. And if you enjoyed this video and you want to learn more about video editing, camera gear, and how to make better videos, make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit that bell so you don't miss anything. Thanks for watching. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you in the next video. Go watch it now.